Hello. Thank you for joining me for my talk today on 19th century women artists and the challenges that they faced. Here is a painting called The Gallery of the Louvre. It was painted in 1831 through 1832 by Samuel F.B. Morse, who was born in 1791 and died in 1872. Morse was a founder of the National Academy of Design. He was also the first president in 1826. In 1831, he started this painting at the Louvre in Paris, France. He worked daily from a scaffold. It took 2 years to complete. He finished the figures and the frames for the individual works within the studio after returning to New York in late 1832. This magnificent painting was 6 feet by 9 feet. And what he did was he chose the paintings that he wanted and throughout the Louvre and painted them in the gallery setting in the order and composition that he wanted. Morse included himself at the center of the role of a teacher. He leans over a woman sketching who has been identified as his daughter, Susan Walker Morse. Note that there are 2 other women painting within this expansive view. Morse's intention from the start was to use this large 6x9 masterwork to educate the American public and to kickstart interest in the fledgling American art market by taking this painting on tour across young America. He exhibited the Gallery of the Louvre in New York City in the fall of 1833 and again the following spring in New Haven, Connecticut. It was praised by the critics, but it was rejected by the public, thus ending the tour. Crushed by the response, he sold the gallery painting for half of what he had priced it at. He let it go for $1,300 to George Clark, a wealthy New York landowner. Morse soon ceased painting and moved on to his successful experiments with the daguerreotype and the electromagnetic telegraph. The art market was challenging in the early 19th century for all aspiring American artists, but women artists had it especially difficult. Women were not allowed to study nudes. Only men were allowed in those classes. The New York art clubs were social events for men only, with smoking and alcohol served. Women were encouraged to paint landscapes considered too sophisticated for ladies. In puritanical families, it was not considered proper for a woman to be an artist. An example of this was Elizabeth Gilbert Jerome, born in 1824. She had her work destroyed by her mother. She was not allowed to draw or paint while living in the Gilbert home. Eventually, her husband encouraged her, and she studied under Frederick Church in Connecticut. In the antebellum South, it was not considered proper for a woman to directly accept money. A woman's ability to safely travel alone in the wilderness was questioned. In short, the 19th century American view was that the traditional role of a woman was to marry, raise children, and maintain the family household. However, despite all these challenges, many 19th century women did become successful artists. I have identified 225 listed 19th century women artists. Of these, 47 were landscape painters born before 1840. Let's take a quick look at a variety of successful women artists to see what they had in common. The first one here is Sarah Cole. Sarah was 33 years older than Caroline Clowes and died the year before Caroline was born. Sarah, the younger sister of Thomas Cole, was a landscape painter from Catskill, New York, just like her brother. Of course, Thomas Cole was credited with starting the Hudson River School. Sarah exhibited at the National Academy, the Maryland Historical Society, and the American Art Union. She accompanied her brother on sketching trips. It is believed that she was taught by her brother. The majority of her original paintings are now lost. Key takeaways: Sarah was unmarried. Her brother assisted her. Her legacy was lost. She signed her name on her paintings, Sarah Cole. Fanny was one of the premier artists for Currier and Ives. She is generally regarded as the leading American woman lithographer of her time. Born in England, Fanny married in 1832 and had 2 children. Her and her husband operated a lithography business in England, where she was the principal artist and the lithographer, and he was the printer. The Palmers emigrated to the United States in 1843, settling in New York City, where they opened their own lithography business. In 1849, she was hired by Nathaniel Currier, and her husband dropped out of the business. Her husband died in 1857. Fanny remained the principal support of her children, granddaughter, and sister Maria Bond. A large body of her work bearing her name was entirely original, drawn, painted, and lithographed by her. Key takeaways: she was widowed, she was a single mom, she was the breadwinner. She was married for 25 years, widowed for 19 years. She signed her artwork F. F. Palmer, first initials and last name. Her legacy is restored. Eliza was born in Ireland. Her family emigrated to the United States in 1840. With the encouragement of her father, a Methodist minister, she became a noted landscape painter. In 1849, she married Henry. They lived in New York City and had 2 daughters. By 1855, she was exhibiting at the National Academy. In 1858, her husband died. She was married for 9 years and widowed for 39 years. She started teaching at an art school for the next 15 years. She also opened a studio on Broadway and studied landscape painting with painters James and William Hart. Both James and William Hart are known Hudson River School landscape artists. In 1861, she studied in Paris with her daughters. In 1869, she was one of the first women elected at the National Academy of Design in New York City. 1873, she traveled to Colorado. She produced etchings of landscapes, resulting in a book, Summer Etchings in Colorado, published in 1873, and she had a national exhibition in New York in 1874. She also exhibited at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial. In 1878, she moved to Paris, returning in 1882 to New York, where she and her daughters taught art classes and participated in the Craigmore Art Colony on the Shawangunk Ridge in Ulster County, New York. In 1885, she moved permanently to Paris, where she passed away. Key takeaways: she grew up in a progressive family. She was widowed, a single mom. She traveled. She was very independent. She signed with her full name, and her legacy is restored. Lily was born in England in 1822, emigrated to the United States in 1830. During her childhood, she was educated at home and she showed early art talent. The family moved to Ohio. Her liberal parents supported her pursuits as an artist. In 1841, Spencer had her first exhibit held in a local church. The admission fee of 25 cents went toward her education. Lily's father took her to Cincinnati for formal instruction. She settled in Cincinnati, marrying Benjamin Spencer in 1844, and then they moved to New York City. Progressively reversing roles, Lily earned the family income while Benjamin did the household duties. He was also her art assistant, stretching canvases, preparing exhibitions, and dealing with marketing and sales. In 1879, they moved to rural Highland, New York. Her paintings reflect this change with increased details in landscapes. Her husband died in 1890. Lily worked until the day of her death in 1902. She was buried in the Highland Cemetery. Key takeaways: grew up in a progressive family, supportive husband, determined. She was a breadwinner. She signed Lily Spencer, and her legacy is restored. Next, Rosa was born in 1822 in France. Her father, Oscar, was a trained painter and taught the fundamentals of art to Rosa. Her father was an important influence, and I quote from Rosa, "To his doctrines I owe my great and glorious ambition for the sex to which I proudly belong, and whose independence I shall defend until my dying day." Rosa was intrigued by the study and form of farm animals. She was known for attending horse fairs and slaughterhouses to gain the most thorough and realistic understanding of animal anatomy. Rosa distinguished herself from her contemporaries by dressing in men's clothing, with an express license to do so granted by the police. Refusing to marry, and in later life keeping a menagerie of personal pets rumored to include a lion and a lioness. In 1865, she became the first woman to be presented with a Cross of the Legion of Honor. The wife of Emperor Napoleon III bestowed the honor with these words, "Genius has no sex." Rosa's fame spread internationally with the wide exhibition and praise of her 1853 painting, The Horse Fair, which is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. You'll note here that in 1890, Lucky Platts in Poughkeepsie gave away a print of this famous painting at the opening in the springtime. Father was an artist, and she never married. She was determined. She was very independent. She signed Rosa Bonheur, and her legacy is intact. Born in Binghamton, New York, Susan Waters grew up in Friendsville, Pennsylvania, and earned her tuition at the Friendsville boarding school with drawings for her natural history teacher. She was a self-taught artist. In 1841, she married William Waters, a Quaker, who encouraged her talent. Her husband's health problems left Susan in the position of family provider. She worked in southern New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey with a studio in Bordentown, New Jersey. Her favorite subject was sheep, which she kept in her backyard. She has been listed in a number of sources as the best 19th century painter of sheep. Of course, Caroline Clowes hasn't been born yet. Susan exhibited at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial. Waters continued until the end of her life to paint. Key takeaways: progressive family, supportive husband, determined, breadwinner, signed her full name. Her legacy is intact. Boston-born Sarah became a painter whose work reflected her extensive travels in Colorado, Illinois, New York, New England, and Texas. In 1851, she married a physician, George Hardinge, and they lived in Brooklyn. A year later, they traveled to Texas to claim inherited land from her deceased brother. She called her 3 sons born in Texas our trio Texans. In Texas, Sarah created 19 small watercolor scenes of early Texas history. These paintings are in the collection of the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art in Fort Worth, Texas. In 1856, the family left Texas, having failed to sell the inherited property and having been frightened by Indian raids. George continued to speculate wildly with his wife's inheritance, and he returned to Texas in 1857. Sarah divorced George for desertion in 1865. She lived in Brooklyn. She was mostly self-taught, having a long career listed in directories as an artist until 1908, when she was age 84. Key takeaways: she was determined, she was the breadwinner, she traveled, her legacy is restored, she signed with her first initial S and her last name Hardinge. Ellen was born in Connecticut in 1830. She studied in Massachusetts with Thomas Edwards at the Lowell Institute and in 1864 in Paris. Ellen was a popular landscape painter in oil and watercolor and a teacher of art in Boston, Massachusetts. She had hundreds of pupils. Among many commissions of hers were more than 100 watercolor depictions of old homesteads of Marlborough, Massachusetts. They illustrated a book. She was known to have painted in the White Mountains of New Hampshire as well as in the South and as far away as California. She traveled in Europe and also sketched in Egypt and Algiers. Key takeaways: she never married, she was determined, she was independent, she was well-traveled, she signed with her first initials E.M. and her last name Carpenter. Her legacy is slowly being restored. Charlotte was born in Waterville, New York in 1833. She married early and moved to the frontier town of Iowa City, Iowa. Her husband died several years after their marriage, and she became deaf, something she jokingly later said was an advantage because she couldn't hear the scathing remarks of the critics. She returned to Waterville and committed herself to a career in art. Her first teacher was James Brevoort, a landscape painter of New York City. She trained for another 10 years abroad, first in Paris, where she exhibited at the Paris Salon, and then 6 years in Holland. A studio fire destroyed the output of all these years in Europe. In 1876, her painting, A French Village, had earned her much praise at the Philadelphia Centennial. In the early 1880s, she returned permanently to New York City, where she had already been exhibiting at the National Academy of Design, devoting herself to the American landscape. In 1910, she was elected an associate to the National Academy of Design. Being well aware of discrimination against women artists by male jurors, she always signed her work C.B. Coleman. She continued painting almost to her death at age 89. Key takeaways: she was widowed, no children, she traveled, she was independent, she signed with her initials and last name, and her legacy is restored. After the death of her parents, Fidelia became a mother's helper in a Quaker household in Brooklyn, New York. She became a student of William Trost Richards at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He encouraged her highly realistic style of recording nature with botanical accuracy, and once she got her own studio, he promoted her among his wealthy friends. Bridges became a specialist in detailed watercolor studies of plants, flowers, and birds in their natural surroundings. She was a follower of the Pre-Raphaelite movement promoted by John Ruskin. Incidentally, Caroline Clowes' work also reflects this same Pre-Raphaelite school, in that its emphasis on detail and light and so forth. I'm sure that both Caroline and Fidelia knew each other. In 1874, Bridges was elected an associate of the National Academy of Design, and in 1875 became a member of the National Watercolor Society. She exhibited extensively, including at the 1876 centennial, where she had 3 watercolors in the watercolor department. In 1876, she sold her first watercolors to publisher Louis Prang. She worked for Prang for 19 years, designing greeting cards and illustrating calendars and books. Key takeaways: she never married, she was independent, she traveled, she signed with her first initial F and her last name Bridges. Her legacy is restored. Laura Woodward was Florida's most important 19th century woman artist. She was born in Mount Hope, Orange County, New York in 1834, and by the early 1870s she was a professional artist living in New York City. She painted throughout the Northeast and exhibited widely. In the 1880s, Woodward began to spend the winters in St. Augustine, Florida. By 1889, Woodward was in Palm Beach and Jupiter, Florida, painting amid what was then largely jungle and swampland inhabited by panthers, bears, and alligators. She brought her watercolor sketches of that area back to St. Augustine, where she joined other artists at Henry M. Flagler's Ponce de Leon Hotel. Woodward told Henry Flagler, a developer, that Palm Beach should be developed as a resort, using her paintings as full-color evidence of her visionary ideas. Flagler bought property in the same locations depicted in her paintings. When Flagler was constructing his Palm Beach Hotel in 1893, he established a home and studio there for Laura. Woodward made Palm Beach her home from 1893 to 1926. Laura was inducted into the Florida Artists Hall of Fame in 2013. Key takeaways: never married, independent, traveled, legacy intact. She signed L. Woodward, also L.W., and a few Laura Woodward full signatures. Julie's family immigrated to America in 1831 from Scotland and settled in Albany, New York. She was the youngest of 10 children and the only one born in America. It is believed that she studied and learned to paint from her older brothers, William and James Hart, both well-known Hudson River School landscape painters. Julie used their 10th Street studios to showcase her work. In 1853, Julie Hart married a journalist named George Beers. They had 2 daughters, Minnie and Kitty. George died in 1856, leaving Julie a young widow of 22 with 2 very young daughters. She moved to New York City, setting up housekeeping in a studio in the Dodsworth building with the 2 little girls. Julie supported herself, Minnie, and Kitty by taking groups of young ladies on extensive sketching and painting trips, and with the sales of her landscapes. By the 1870s and 80s, she was exhibiting widely in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Many years later, she remarried and was still painting well into her 70s. Key takeaways: she was widowed, a single mom. She had brothers that were artists. She taught other women. She was very determined, signed with her full name, was well-traveled, and her legacy is intact. Susie was the daughter of Samuel Barstow, an old-time tea merchant in New York. She graduated from Rutgers Female Institute in New York in 1853, the first college for women in New York. Barstow was both a secretary and teacher at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences until at least 1910. She exhibited her landscapes widely in New York and Pennsylvania. Initially, she exhibited both still life and landscape paintings, and then she turned almost exclusively to landscape, seeking out mountainous regions in the Northeast. She traveled to Switzerland, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and France. Key takeaways: she signed with her first initials, S&M, and last name Barstow. She never married, she was independent, she was a teacher, she was well-traveled, and her legacy is restored. Evelina was the daughter of artist Henry Mount. She was raised in Stony Brook, Long Island. Her father died when she was a child. Her uncle, William Sidney Mount, took a particular interest in her art. She spent her first 3 decades, 30 years, working with him in his studio. He taught her about the New York art scene and encouraged her to go to exhibitions in that city. In the 1860s, she took lessons from James Hart. Most of her serious work was done between 1860 and the late 1890s. In 1910, she suffered a debilitating stroke and was confined to a wheelchair until her death in 1920. Key takeaways: she signed Nina Mount. She never married. She exhibited. She trained by her uncle and James Hart. Mary lived in New York City from 1867 to 1875 and then moved to Hoboken, New Jersey. She studied with Asher Durand, a well-known Hudson River School artist, and was described as his favorite woman student in the book Life and Times of Asher B. Durand by his son John Durand. Her studio was located in the YMCA building in New York while she resided in Brooklyn. She exhibited widely, including at the National Academy, Brooklyn Art Association, and as far away as San Francisco. In spite of her many exhibition records, only a small number of her paintings have come to light. Key takeaways: she signed with her first initials M and J and her last name Walters. She never married. She was trained by Durand. Her legacy is intact, very independent. Virginia was born in North Illinois in 1838. In 1869, she married John Titcomb from Farmington, Maine. Together, the couple had 3 children. Virginia exhibited at the National Academy of Design and was a contributor to Harper's Bazaar, Brooklyn Eagle, and other publications. In 1884, she founded and was president of the Patriotic League of the Revolution and a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Virginia lived in Brooklyn and died in Rockville Center, Long Island in 1912 at age 73. Key takeaways: she was married. She was an artist, photographer, writer, and lecturer. Her legacy is slowly being restored. No signature examples could be found for paintings. Maria was born in Portland, Maine, the daughter of a landscape painter. From him, Maria would have received encouragement as well as early training. Tragically, the Beckett family home and its contents, including the artwork of both father and daughter, were lost in the Great Fire of Portland in 1866. Mr. Beckett died 2 months later. Maria fled to Boston and immersed herself fully in training as a pupil of William Morse Hunt. Later, she studied in France, absorbing the characteristics of the Barbizon School. She exhibited her work widely in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. In an 1884 letter, Beckett wrote this about herself, and I quote, "Maria J.C. Beckett was born in Portland, Maine, where the Great Fire destroyed their home and caused the death of her father, himself a distinguished amateur. Miss Beckett removed at once to Boston and entered upon the study of art, to which she has since devoted herself. She has studied with the best masters in this country. She enjoyed also great advantages for study in Paris, Rome, and Germany. Miss Beckett's favorite subjects are woods and trees." Maria established a winter studio in St. Augustine, Florida, part of an art colony fostered by the prominent developer of resort hotels, Henry Flagler, And keep in mind that's where Laura Woodward was as well. And when Laura encouraged Henry to further develop in Florida, I'm sure all these women artists, most of them got to know each other, and their paths crossed between exhibitions and some of the places that they went and painted in. Key takeaways: she never married. She signed Maria A. Beckett, full name. She was very independent, traveled. She was trained by her father, then in Boston and Europe. Her legacy is restored. Landscape, still life, and portrait painter Mary was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1840. She studied under Robert Wiley at the Pennsylvania Academy of Art and at the Art Student League, and in Paris, where she spent several years. She exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1864 and at the National Academy in 1866. The artist spent most of her life in New York City, where she died in 1911. Note that she and Caroline Clowes were the only two women that exhibited in the main hall of the 1876 Philadelphia exhibition. Mary Collick's two paintings flank Caroline's on the wall. They must have known each other for sure. So keep in mind that the 1876 exhibition had a women's pavilion also for art, and many of the women that I've indicated paintings at the exhibition on that centennial were in the women's division. So only Caroline and Mary Hollick were in the main hall with all the men. Key takeaways: she signed M. Collick, first initial, last name, never married. She was traveled, independent, and her legacy is slowly developing. Agnes studied under George Hetzel at the School of Design for Women in Pittsburgh. She graduated with the first class of the Old Pittsburgh Academy of Design in 1872 and studied in Paris. Miss Way was the first art teacher in the Pittsburgh public schools. She exhibited widely, including Philadelphia, Boston, and New Orleans. Agnes was a founder of the Pittsburgh Art Society. In 1872, she was a faculty member of the Pennsylvania College for Women and took her first airplane trip at the age of 90. She painted with the Gloucester Art Colony in New England at the age of 93. Agnes cared for an invalid sister for 25 years and continued to paint in her third-floor studio through her 100th birthday. Key takeaways: she never married, she was well-traveled, she was independent. Her legacy is kind of weak and most of her works have been lost. However, when she signed with her full name, Agnes C. Way. A talented pupil of Thomas Ekin in Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Elizabeth painted in the American realist style. Elizabeth Coffin never married, but had family inheritance that allowed her financial stability, including extensive travel. She attended the Friends Seminary in Manhattan and then in 1865 enrolled at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Maria Mitchell, a Nantucket-born astronomy professor at Vassar and a friend of Coffin, encouraged Elizabeth to attend Vassar because of the fine arts focus of the curriculum and its high expectations of women to develop their own talents. At Vassar, Elizabeth Coffin took art classes from the Dutch painter Henry van Ingen, who also Caroline Clowes had learned from and was a friend of. In 1872, she became the first woman to enroll in the Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague, the oldest school in the Netherlands. After 3 years of study, she had 6 awards, 4 of which were in competition with men. In 1876, she was back at Vassar, where she received a Master's of Fine Arts degree, the first person in the United States to achieve that distinction. She was the founder of the Brooklyn Art Guild, which she served as president for 9 years. She had a studio in Brooklyn. In 1892, at the National Academy of Design, she won the Norman Dodge Prize for the best picture ever painted by a woman in the United States. I'm not so sure how they figured that out, but congratulations that she got it. In 1900, she became a full-time resident of Nantucket. Many people found her eccentric because, among other things, she slept outdoors on a specially built platform. Key takeaways: came from a progressive home life. She never married. She signed her first initial E last name Coffin, but she also signed some paintings Elizabeth R. Coffin. She was well-traveled, very independent, and also wealthy. And I was just mentioning wealthy. I've heard a number of times from people the perception that, oh, these women that were successful, they were able to be successful because they had a lot of money and could do what they want. This is actually the first example that I've shown someone that inherited a lot of money and was able to live off of that money to be an art. Most of the 19th century landscape painters had to work extremely hard to make their place and did not come from money. Growing up in Chicago, Annie showed early art talent indicated by her winning an award for pencil drawing at age 12. From 1868 to 72, she studied with Henry Chapman Ford. In 1874, at age 22, she was the first woman to open an art studio in Chicago. She established a reputation for excellent teaching at the Chicago Academy of Design. In 1876, Shaw was elected to full membership of the Academy, the first woman to achieve that distinction. Her painting, titled Illinois Prairie, was at the 1876 centennial. A solo exhibition and sale held at the Art Institute of Chicago after her death included 241 oil paintings and 50 watercolors, of which very few can be found today. She passed away at only 35 years old. I do not know the cause of her death, but I have a feeling that's why there was a large liquidation of paintings right after her death. Her exhibition venues were extensive. Key takeaways: she never married. She signed with her full name, Annie C. Shaw. Her legacy is developing. She was very independent. So, what do most of these successful 19th century artists have in common? And how does this relate to Caroline Clowes? First, a progressive family environment. So look, Caroline Clowes had Heartsease. This home was a very progressive environment. Caroline was encouraged. Her Aunt Louisa, who's shown here in the photo, was an artist and an art teacher, and she gave Caroline her first drawing books that got her started. Also, she happened to be growing up in Poughkeepsie, which had the reputation as the city of schools, and Caroline had attended 3 different schools in Poughkeepsie, including the Female Academy, which is shown here on the right, and her teacher, her art teacher there, was a successful painter, Frederick Rondell. The second characteristic I would say that they all have in common is determination. And, they were very determined. You can have an opportunity, but unless someone is determined, it's not going to happen. This article was found in Caroline Clowes' purse. She underlined, "A woman's place is the one that she can fill." And I think that is so true of all of these women artists. They were determined to fill a certain spot, and they worked at it until they completed that. Next, they were unmarried or widowed. And Caroline never married. And in a letter from her sister Lydia, there was a comment about Caroline being, and I quote, "wedded to your easel." Here is also an image of her 1870 art studio, which still stands today at Heartsease property in LaGrange in the yard. Which, by the way, Heartsease is still owned by the same family and, occupied by the same family members all the way down through. Next is independent, fearless, and traveled. Caroline exhibited widely. She was in Philadelphia, she was in Boston, Brooklyn, New York, but she also painted in Florida on land that she purchased with her own money. And she exhibited, as you can see here, in London. We don't know if she went to London or whether she sent items to that exhibit, but she was fearless and she was independent, and she did well. Next, they had some type of male influence, a male teacher, could be a father, a brother, a husband. In this case, in Caroline's case, it was Frederick Rondell, who was her main teacher at the academy, and Henry Van Ingen. And as we'll see, also there was James Wright, who will be in our next slide. But she did have good influence here, and Frederick Rondell became a good friend of the family. The photo of him with his wife here was actually in Caroline Clowes' photo album. So they were friends of the family as well and stayed in contact through their whole life. Next is that they typically signed with their initials. Women tended to sign with their initials. This prevented possible gender bias by the jurors or the judges of exhibitions. If they didn't know that you were female or male, they should be judging by the artwork itself. So, and here we have an example where it says, "They suppose you are a gentleman, and I did not undeceive them. They predict a brilliant future for you." This was a quote from an 1870 letter to Caroline from Poughkeepsie portrait painter James Wright. James Wright had been showing some of Caroline's work in New York City on her behalf, and he showed the work to the prestigious gallery of Goupil's in New York City, and them not knowing whether she was male or female, evidently they assumed that the quality of her work, she was a man. So take a look here, and I think this quote that I found, I think kind of wraps it up pretty good. "Because of multiple reasons, art created by women artists was largely forgotten or ignored by official art history. By official, I mean universities, course books, museums, etc." And I think that is so true, but it's starting to bounce back now. It seems like late in the 20th century, and certainly since the internet and the 21st century, a lot of these women's stories are now being told. They're being resurrected. There's Wikipedia pages on many of the artists where if you went back before 1970, I would say there was very, very little, and it has been building ever since. Samuel Morse did his part almost 200 years ago to promote women artists in his monumental painting, The Gallery of the Louvre. Here are three women are painting, and also you have a mother and daughter that are admiring art. Of the 10 figures that Samuel Morse added in his painting in 1832, 6 were women. And I think this says a lot at a very early time. When you look at the 30s, before that, you're talking about women artists were primarily portrait painters that were educated and taught by their fathers. So when you're getting to 1830, you can see that even Samuel Morse, as the first president of the association and a well-established portrait painter, he does a project for 2 years and it didn't fly, and it caused him to leave the art field and go into the scientific field. But in that earliest time point, he was promoting women artists and trying to get something started in America. So it's to his credit that he put these women in. So I want to thank you for joining me here, and I hope I've been able to share something of interest to you. I very much enjoyed doing the research. It's hard at times to stop researching. There's so many wonderful women. I was editing a couple more down, and then I said, I don't have enough room in the time span. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up, of the 21 artists that I listed and Caroline Clowes, I will put up the names of them below with this video and have their short bios or whatever I have as links, so that you can drill deeper and actually see more about their life. Many of these artists deserve their own presentation. They're that strong and that good. Thank you again for attending. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.